The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Clarence House as King Charles III stood at his study window, his weathered hands clasped tightly behind his back. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier than it did in this moment, as he prepared to make a decision that would forever alter the fabric of his marriage and the monarchy itself. Camilla, now queen consort, sat in the drawing room below, completely unaware that her husband was about to deliver news that would shatter her world. She was reviewing the guest list for an upcoming charity gala, her pen moving gracefully across the ivory paper as she made careful notations. The Parker Bowles family name appeared multiple times on the list, a fact that would soon become the source of unprecedented royal drama. For months, Charles had been receiving disturbing reports from his private secretary and security detail about Camilla's relatives. The intelligence was damning and could no longer be ignored. Her younger brother, Derek Parker Bowles, had been caught in a scandal involving illegal gambling operations in Monaco. The revelations didn't stop there. Her sister-in-law, Sarah Parker Bowles, had been secretly selling private information about royal family gatherings to European tabloids for substantial sums of money. The most devastating blow came when Charles learned that Camilla's own son, Tom Parker Bowles, had been using his connection to the royal family to secure lucrative business deals that bordered on corruption. Tom had been leveraging his stepfather's position to influence government contracts, particularly in the food and hospitality industry where he had built his career. The ethical violations were clear, and the potential for public scandal was enormous. Charles had spent sleepless nights weighing his options. As king, he had sworn to uphold the dignity and integrity of the monarchy above all else. The institution that had survived for over 1,000 years could not be compromised by the actions of his wife's family, no matter how much he loved Camilla personally. The decision he was about to make would test the very foundations of their relationship. The king's private secretary, Sir Edmund Worthington, had presented him with irrefutable evidence just 3 days earlier. Photographs, financial records, recorded conversations, and witness testimonies painted a picture of a family that had systematically exploited their royal connections for personal gain. The scope of their activities was staggering, involving millions of pounds and reaching into the highest levels of British society. What made the situation even more painful for Charles was the realization that Camilla might have known about some of these activities. While there was no evidence of her direct participation, several family meetings had taken place at properties she owned, and some of the financial transactions had passed through accounts she had access to. The king's legal advisors had made it clear that her potential complicity could not be ignored. As Charles prepared to confront his wife, he reflected on their long and complicated history together. They had weathered so many storms throughout their decades-long relationship, from the public scrutiny during his marriage to Diana to the gradual acceptance of their love by the British people. Camilla had stood by his side through the death of his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, and had gracefully assumed her role as queen consort despite the challenges. The irony was not lost on him that the woman who had helped him modernize the monarchy and connect with ordinary people was now at the center of a crisis that threatened to undermine everything they had worked to achieve. The British public had finally embraced Camilla, seeing her as a stabilizing influence on Charles and a genuine person who brought warmth to the often cold institution of royalty. Down in the drawing room, Camilla continued her work, occasionally glancing at family photographs that adorned the antique side tables. Pictures of Tom and Laura at various royal events, images of family gatherings at her beloved Ray Mill house, and formal portraits from recent state occasions created a visual timeline of how thoroughly integrated the Parker Bowles family had become with the royal household. She had no idea that upstairs, Charles was reviewing a comprehensive dossier that detailed how her family had systematically betrayed the trust placed in them. The evidence showed a pattern of behavior that went back years, suggesting that their activities had intensified after Charles became king, and their access to privileged information had increased correspondingly. The king's security chief had been particularly concerned about the national security implications of the family's actions. Information about royal travel schedules, security procedures, and private conversations with foreign dignitaries had potentially been compromised. The revelation that Sarah Parker Bowles had been in contact with journalists from countries that were not always aligned with British interests had raised red flags throughout the intelligence community. Charles knew that his decision would inevitably lead to questions about his own judgment. Critics would ask how he could have been so blind to what was happening under his own roof. The opposition press, which had never fully accepted Camilla, would seize upon this scandal as vindication of their long-held skepticism about her suitability as queen consort. The king's advisors had been unanimous in their recommendation. The Parker Bowles family had to be completely severed from any official connection to the royal household. Their security clearances would be revoked, their invitations to royal events withdrawn, and their access to royal properties terminated immediately. It was a decision that would effectively exile them from the life they had grown accustomed to over the past 2 decades. As he prepared to go downstairs and face Camilla, Charles steeled himself for what would undoubtedly be the most difficult conversation of their marriage. He knew that asking her to choose between her family and the monarchy was unfair, but the evidence left him no choice. The institution he served was bigger than any individual, including himself and his wife. The weight of history pressed down upon him as he remembered other members of the royal family who had been forced to make similar choices. His great-uncle Edward VIII had abdicated for love, but Charles could not abandon his duty, even for the woman who had become his anchor in life. Instead, he would have to ask Camilla to sacrifice her family relationships for the good of the crown. The morning light streamed through the tall windows of Clarence's house as Charles finally made his way downstairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. In his hand, he carried a leather portfolio containing all the evidence that would justify his decision, but he knew that no amount of documentation could ease the pain he was about to inflict on the woman he loved. Camilla looked up with a smile as he entered the drawing room, her face radiating the contentment that had become her trademark since their marriage. She had no way of knowing that within the next few minutes, her world would be turned upside down, and she would be forced to confront the reality that her family's greed had jeopardized everything she held dear. The king's hands trembled slightly as he approached her chair, and, for a moment, he almost lost his resolve. But then he thought about his mother's unwavering commitment to duty, his father's dedication to service, and the millions of people who looked to the monarchy for stability and moral leadership. The decision had been made, and there could be no turning back. As Charles prepared to speak the words that would change their lives forever, the quiet domesticity of the moment felt almost surreal. The woman who had brought him such happiness was about to learn that her family's actions had made them enemies of the very institution she had worked so hard to serve and protect. Charles cleared his throat softly, causing Camilla to look up from her papers with that warm smile that had first captured his heart decades ago. The morning light caught the subtle highlights in her hair as she set down her pen and gave him her full attention, completely unaware that her world was about to crumble around her. "Camilla, my darling, we need to talk," Charles said, his voice carrying a gravity that immediately caught her attention. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw was set in that particular manner that appeared whenever he faced difficult state business. But this felt different, more personal somehow. "Of course," she replied, gesturing to the chair across from her. "You look troubled, Charles. Is everything all right with the Commonwealth meetings? I know the Australian situation has been weighing on your mind." Charles remained standing, the leather portfolio heavy in his hands. He had rehearsed this conversation countless times in his mind, but now that the moment had arrived, the carefully chosen words seemed to desert him. How did one tell the woman they loved that her family had betrayed everything they stood for? "This isn't about Commonwealth affairs," he began slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's about something much closer to home. Something that affects us directly, affects our marriage, and affects the future of the monarchy itself." Camilla's expression shifted from casual interest to concern. She had been married to Charles long enough to recognize the signs of a serious crisis. The last time she had seen him this distressed was during the final weeks of Queen Elizabeth's life, when the weight of impending kingship had seemed almost unbearable. Charles opened the portfolio and withdrew the first document, a financial report that detailed suspicious transactions linked to her son Tom's business dealings. His hands shook slightly as he placed it on the coffee table between them, the official government seal clearly visible at the top of the page. "Camilla, I need you to look at this," he said, his voice gaining strength as his royal training took over. "It's about Tom, about Derek, about your entire family's activities over the past several years." As Camilla leaned forward to examine the document, Charles watched her face carefully. The color slowly drained from her cheeks as she read the detailed breakdown of financial irregularities, the connection between Tom's restaurant ventures and government contracts, and the suspiciously large sums of money that had changed hands at crucial moments. "I don't understand," she said, her voice becoming smaller with each word. "These are just business transactions. Tom has always been entrepreneurial, you know that. He's worked hard to build his career in the food industry. Charles placed another document on the table, this one containing photographs of Derek at an underground gambling establishment in Monte Carlo, clearly engaged in activities that went far beyond casual gaming. The images showed him meeting with known associates of organized crime figures, exchanging envelopes that could only contain money or sensitive information. Your brother has been involved with some very dangerous people, Camilla, Charles explained, his voice taking on the formal tone he used during state functions. The security services have been monitoring these activities for months. They believe he may have shared sensitive information about our family's movements and security arrangements. Camilla's hands began to tremble as she stared at the photographs. The brother she had always seen as slightly wayward but essentially harmless was clearly involved in activities that could endanger not just the royal family, but national security itself. The implications were staggering. There's more, Charles continued, producing a thick folder containing recorded transcripts and additional photographs. Sarah has been selling stories to European tabloids. Not just gossip or speculation, but detailed information about private family conversations, security protocols, and confidential state matters that she could only have learned through her connection to our household. The evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. Recorded phone conversations showed Sarah Parker Bowles negotiating prices for specific pieces of information, discussing details about private royal gatherings that had never been made public, and even sharing insights about Charles's private meetings with government officials. Camilla sank back in her chair as if the weight of the revelations was physically pushing her down. The family she had always fiercely protected and defended had been systematically betraying the trust placed in them by their connection to the royal household. Worse still, they had been putting Charles himself at risk. "How long have you known?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The investigation has been ongoing for 6 months," Charles replied, taking a seat across from her for the first time. "I didn't want to burden you with suspicions until we had concrete proof. I kept hoping the reports were wrong, that there would be some reasonable explanation." Camilla looked up at him, her eyes beginning to fill with tears. "You've been carrying this alone for 6 months? Charles, why didn't you tell me? We could have addressed this together as a family." "Because I wasn't sure how much you knew," Charles said, the words hanging in the air between them like an accusation. "Some of these meetings took place at Ray Mill House. Some of the financial transactions went through accounts you have access to. My advisors weren't certain of your level of involvement." The implication hit Camilla like a physical blow. Her husband, the man she had loved and supported through every crisis of his life, had suspected her of being complicit in her family's betrayal. The hurt in her eyes was so profound that Charles almost reached out to comfort her, but the weight of his duty held him back. "You thought I was involved?" she asked, her voice breaking slightly. "You actually believed I would betray you, betray everything we've worked for?" Charles looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "I didn't want to believe it. But the evidence suggested that at minimum, you had to know something about what was happening. The meetings at your property, the timing of certain information leaks coinciding with family gatherings." Camilla stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. She walked to the window overlooking the garden where they had shared so many peaceful moments together, her silhouette framed against the morning light. When she spoke again, her voice was steadier, but Charles could hear the deep hurt underlying every word. "In all our years together, through every scandal and crisis, I never once doubted your integrity or your commitment to doing what was right," she said without turning around. "I stood by you when the entire world seemed against us. I accepted the hatred and criticism because I believed in you and in us." Charles felt his own eyes beginning to sting with unshed tears. "Camilla, please understand. As king, I cannot allow personal feelings to compromise my judgment. The evidence was circumstantial but concerning enough that..." She turned around to face him, and Charles was shocked by the transformation in her appearance. The warm, confident woman who had entered the morning had been replaced by someone who looked older, more fragile, and deeply wounded. "What happens now?" she asked simply. Charles straightened his shoulders, falling back into his role as monarch rather than husband. "Your family must be completely severed from any connection to the royal household. Their security clearances are being revoked as we speak. They will no longer be welcome at any royal events or properties. Any business arrangements that may have benefited from their royal connections must be dissolved immediately." "And me?" Camilla asked, though she seemed to already know the answer. "You will need to make a choice," Charles said, the words feeling like shards of glass in his throat. "You can maintain your relationships with your family, but that would mean stepping back from your role as queen consort. Or you can distance yourself from them completely and continue to serve the monarchy with me. The silence that followed was deafening. Outside, the sounds of London traffic provided a distant backdrop to the destruction of a marriage that had survived decades of public scrutiny and personal trials. The choice Charles was forcing upon his wife was impossible, and they both knew it. Camilla walked back to her chair and sat down slowly, her movements careful and measured as if she were afraid of falling. When she looked up at Charles again, there was something different in her eyes, a hardness that had never been there before. "You're asking me to choose between my family and my husband," she said quietly. "You're asking me to abandon the people who loved and supported me long before I ever met you, based on their mistakes and poor judgment. I'm asking you to choose between your family and the monarchy," Charles corrected, his voice taking on a formal tone that created an invisible barrier between them. "This isn't about our personal relationship. This is about the institution we serve and the trust the British people have placed in us." Camilla nodded slowly, as if finally understanding the full scope of what was being asked of her. The man she loved was no longer just her husband in this moment, but a king who had made an irreversible decision that would define both their futures. The afternoon sun had shifted position in the sky, casting new shadows across the drawing room as Camilla sat in stunned silence, absorbing the magnitude of what Charles had revealed. The evidence spread across the coffee table seemed to mock her, each document a testament to how thoroughly her family had betrayed not just the royal household, but her personal trust as well. Charles remained seated across from her, watching as various emotions played across his wife's face. Shock had given way to hurt, which had then transformed into something approaching anger. He could see her mind working, processing the implications of each revelation, and likely remembering conversations and incidents that now took on new meaning. "I need to understand something," Camilla said finally, her voice hollow. "When did you stop trusting me, Charles? When did I become a suspect rather than your partner?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with years of shared intimacy and mutual support. Charles felt the weight of it settle in his chest like a physical pain. He had not anticipated how much his investigation would damage their personal relationship, how the very act of gathering evidence against her family would erect barriers between them. "It wasn't about trust," he said carefully, though even as he spoke the words, he knew they were inadequate. "It was about being thorough, about ensuring that we had all the facts before making any decisions." Camilla's laugh was bitter and devoid of humor. "You investigated me, Charles. You had people watching my movements, monitoring my communications, analyzing my financial records. Don't pretend this was anything other than a complete breakdown of trust." Charles looked down at his hands, unable to deny the truth of her accusation. The investigation had indeed extended to Camilla herself, though he had tried to keep that aspect as limited as possible. His security advisors had insisted it was necessary, given the serious nature of the allegations and her family's level of access to sensitive information. "The security services recommended a comprehensive review," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I tried to limit the scope, but once we discovered the extent of your family's activities, they insisted on examining all possible connections." "And what did your comprehensive review discover about me?" Camilla asked, her tone sharp with hurt and indignation. "What evidence did you find of my disloyalty or corruption?" Charles met her gaze for the first time since producing the evidence. "Nothing," he admitted. "There was no evidence of your direct involvement in any wrongdoing. But the investigation did reveal that you had been present during some questionable conversations, and that your accounts had been used for transfers that, while not illegal, raised questions about your awareness of your family's activities." Camilla closed her eyes and took a deep breath, as if trying to center herself before responding. When she opened them again, Charles could see that she had made some kind of internal decision, though he couldn't yet discern what it might be. "You want to know about those conversations?" she said, her voice gaining strength. "Yes, I heard Tom talking about business opportunities that seemed too good to be true. Yes, I noticed that Derek always seemed to have more money than his legitimate income could explain. Yes, I was aware that Sarah had been asking unusual questions about our private activities." Charles leaned forward slightly, surprised by her willingness to address these points directly. "But I also trusted that the people I loved wouldn't deliberately put us all at risk," Camilla continued. "I assumed that if there were problems, they would come to me, that we could address them as a family. I never imagined they would systematically exploit their connection to us for personal gain." Why didn't you bring your concerns to me? Charles asked, though he was beginning to suspect he knew the answer. Because I was protecting them, Camilla said simply. Because I hoped that if I spoke to them privately, I could convince them to be more careful, more responsible. I didn't want to create problems between you and my family unless it was absolutely necessary. Charles felt a stab of guilt as he realized how his wife's loyalty to her family had prevented her from seeking his help when she first began to suspect there might be problems. Her attempts to handle the situation quietly had only made her appear more complicit in the eyes of the investigation. Camilla, if you had told me about your suspicions, we could have addressed this before it reached this level, he said, reaching across the table as if to touch her hand before thinking better of it. And what would you have done? She asked pointedly. Would you have given them a quiet warning and trusted them to change their behavior? Or would you have launched a full investigation just as you did anyway? Charles couldn't answer because they both knew the truth. His duty as king would have required him to pursue the matter fully regardless of when he learned about it. The only difference would have been that Camilla might not have felt so betrayed by the process. The sound of footsteps in the hallway interrupted their conversation as Sir Edmund Worthington appeared in the doorway, his face grave with the weight of additional news. Charles gestured for him to enter, though Camilla's expression suggested she would have preferred to continue their private conversation. Your Majesty, Sir Edmund said, bowing slightly to each in turn. I'm afraid there have been further developments that require immediate attention. Charles felt his stomach drop as he realized that the situation was about to become even more complicated. What kind of developments, Edmund? Tom Parker Bowles has been arrested by the Metropolitan Police, Sir Edmund announced, his words falling into the room like a bomb. The charges include fraud, bribery, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. The arrest was made this morning based on evidence gathered during the royal household's security review. Camilla gasped audibly, her hand flying to her chest, as if she had been physically struck. The color completely drained from her face as she processed this latest devastating news. Her son, despite his mistakes and poor judgment, was still her child, and the thought of him in police custody was clearly unbearable. How serious are the charges? Charles asked, though he could see from Sir Edmund's expression that the news was as bad as it could possibly be. Very serious, Your Majesty. The Crown Prosecution Service believes they have sufficient evidence for conviction on all counts. If found guilty, Mr. Parker Bowles could face a substantial prison sentence. Camilla made a small, wounded sound and covered her face with her hands. The reality of her son's situation seemed to break through whatever composure she had been maintaining. This was no longer about abstract concepts of duty and loyalty. This was about her child facing the possibility of years in prison. I need to go to him, she said, standing up abruptly. I need to contact his solicitor, arrange for bail, make sure he's being treated properly. Camilla, wait, Charles said, also rising from his chair. You need to understand the position this puts you in. Any public support you show for Tom right now will be seen as royal endorsement of his alleged criminal activity. She turned to face him, and Charles was startled by the fierce determination in her eyes. He's my son, Charles. Whatever mistakes he's made, whatever crimes he may have committed, he's still my child. I will not abandon him to protect the monarchy's reputation. But that's exactly what I'm asking you to do, Charles said, his voice taking on the formal tone of royal command. I'm asking you to distance yourself from all members of your family, including Tom, until this matter is resolved. The palace cannot be seen as having any connection to these criminal proceedings. You're asking me to abandon my son when he needs me most, Camilla said, her voice rising for the first time during their conversation. You're asking me to choose the monarchy over my own child. Sir Edmund cleared his throat diplomatically, clearly uncomfortable with witnessing this intimate family crisis. Perhaps I should return later when you've had more time to discuss these matters privately. No, stay, Charles said firmly. What other developments do we need to address immediately? Sir Edmund consulted his notes reluctantly. Derek Parker Bowles has fled the country. His last known location was Monaco, but intelligence suggests he may be heading for a non-extradition territory. Sarah Parker Bowles is currently being questioned by police, but has not been charged at this time. Each piece of news seemed to hit Camilla like a physical blow. Her entire family was either under arrest, under investigation, or fleeing the country. The life she had built so carefully around her relationships with both her blood family and her royal family was disintegrating before her eyes. This gets worse by the hour, Charles said, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of frustration and exhaustion. How much of this has reached the press? The arrest has not been publicly announced yet, But it's only a matter of time, Sir Edmund replied. The palace press office is preparing statements, but they need to know the royal household's official position on these matters. Charles looked at his wife, who had sunk back into her chair and appeared to be struggling to process everything that was happening. The woman who had been his strength and support through so many crises was now facing the complete destruction of her family relationships, and he was the one forcing her to make impossible choices. The official position is that the royal household was unaware of these alleged criminal activities and does not condone them in any way, Charles said, his voice taking on the careful neutrality of an official statement. Queen Consort Camilla will be making no public statements regarding these matters, and any suggestion that the royal household was involved in or aware of these activities is categorically false. Camilla looked up at him sharply, realizing that he had just publicly distanced her from her own family without consulting her first. The statement he had just authorized would be interpreted by the press and public as a complete disavowal of any connection to the Parker Bowles family. The late afternoon light filtering through the windows of Clarence House had taken on a golden quality, but neither Charles nor Camilla seemed aware of the passage of time. They remained locked in their positions on opposite sides of the room, the distance between them seeming to grow with each revelation and each decision that drove them further apart. Sir Edmund had departed to handle the immediate crisis management, leaving them alone to confront the personal dimensions of what was rapidly becoming a constitutional crisis. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken accusations and the weight of choices that seemed to have no right answers. Camilla was the first to break the silence, her voice steady despite the emotional turmoil of the past several hours. "You made that statement without consulting me," she said, not looking at Charles as she spoke. "You committed me to a position I haven't agreed to take." "The statement reflected the only position the monarchy can take," Charles replied, though there was less conviction in his voice than before. "We cannot be seen as supporting or endorsing criminal activity, regardless of who is involved." "Tom hasn't been convicted of anything yet," Camilla pointed out sharply. "In this country, people are supposed to be presumed innocent until proven guilty. But you've already decided he's guilty, and that I must abandon him to protect your reputation." Charles walked to the window where Camilla had stood earlier, looking out at the gardens that had always provided him with peace and perspective. "The presumption of innocence applies to the legal system," he said quietly. "The monarchy operates under different standards. We cannot afford to wait for legal proceedings to conclude before protecting the institution." "The institution," Camilla repeated, her voice filled with something approaching contempt. "Always the institution. What about loyalty? What about family? What about the promises we made to each other?" Charles turned back to face her, and she could see the internal struggle playing out across his features. Those promises didn't include protecting criminal activity or allowing personal relationships to compromise the crown. No, but they did include supporting each other through difficult times, Camilla said, rising from her chair and walking toward him. They included trust and partnership and the belief that we would face whatever challenges came our way together. For a moment, Charles's royal facade seemed to crack, and Camilla could see the man she had fallen in love with rather than the king who had been making these impossible demands. "Camilla, you have to understand the position I'm in. If I'm seen as protecting your family, it undermines everything we've tried to build since I became king. And if you force me to abandon my son, it undermines everything we've built as a marriage," Camilla replied, her voice breaking slightly. "You're asking me to prove my loyalty to you by betraying the most fundamental bonds of motherhood." The accusation hung between them, and Charles felt its weight settle into his chest like a stone. He had been so focused on protecting the monarchy that he had perhaps lost sight of what he was asking of the woman he loved. But even as he felt the pull of compassion and personal loyalty, he could hear his mother's voice reminding him that duty must come before personal feelings. "What if there was another way?" Camilla asked suddenly, her voice taking on a desperate quality. "What if I could convince Tom to cooperate fully with the investigation? What if the family made financial restitution for any improper gains? What if we found a solution that addressed the legal issues without requiring me to cut all ties?" Charles shook his head sadly. "The damage goes too deep, Camilla. Even if Tom cooperates, even if restitution is made, the fact remains that your family systematically exploited their connection to the royal household. That betrayal cannot be overlooked or forgiven, at least not publicly." "Then, we're at an impasse," Camilla said quietly, returning to her chair and sitting down with the careful movements of someone who felt suddenly fragile. You're demanding that I choose between my family and my role as queen consort, and I'm telling you that's an impossible choice. Charles joined her in the seating area, taking the chair across from her that he had occupied earlier in the day. The evidence of her family's betrayal still lay scattered across the coffee table between them, a constant reminder of how they had reached this point. What if you took some time away? Charles suggested carefully. A sabbatical from royal duties while the legal proceedings run their course? You could maintain your private relationships without the public being able to interpret that as royal endorsement of their actions. Camilla looked at him with something approaching pity. You still don't understand, do you? This isn't about public perception or managing the crisis. This is about the fact that you investigated your own wife, that you suspected me of criminal wrongdoing, that you're prepared to sacrifice our marriage to protect an institution that will continue long after we're both gone. The monarchy has survived for over 1,000 years because individuals have been willing to make personal sacrifices for its preservation, Charles said, falling back on the arguments that had been drilled into him since childhood. And how many marriages has it destroyed in the process? Camilla asked pointedly. How many families has it torn apart? How many people have paid the price for that survival? Charles didn't answer because they both knew the historical examples were numerous and tragic. The royal family's history was littered with personal sacrifices made in service of institutional survival, from abdications to forced separations to loveless marriages arranged for political convenience. I won't be another casualty of that history, Camilla said firmly. I won't destroy my relationship with my children to preserve an institution that clearly values me less than its own reputation. That's not true, Charles protested, reaching toward her before pulling back. You know how much you mean to me personally. But not enough to trust me when it mattered most, Camilla replied. Not enough to include me in the investigation of my own family. Not enough to give me a chance to address the problems before they reached this level. The truth of her words hit Charles with devastating force. He had indeed failed to trust her, failed to include her as a partner in addressing the crisis, and failed to consider solutions that might have preserved both the monarchy's integrity and their marriage. His training as a monarch had overridden his instincts as a husband. I'm going to see Tom, Camilla announced, standing up and smoothing down her skirt with movements that suggested she was preparing for battle. I'm going to make sure he has proper legal representation and that he's being treated fairly while in custody. Camilla, please reconsider, Charles said, also standing. Any public show of support will be interpreted as royal endorsement of his alleged crimes. It will make the situation exponentially worse for all of us. Then, perhaps I should make clear that I'm not acting in any royal capacity, Camilla suggested, her voice taking on a steely quality that Charles had rarely heard before. Perhaps I should make it clear that I'm acting purely as a mother, without any connection to the royal household. The implication was obvious and devastating. If Camilla publicly separated her personal actions from her royal role, it would effectively announce to the world that there was a fundamental division within the royal marriage. The press and public would immediately seize upon this as evidence of a constitutional crisis. You can't separate yourself from your role as queen consort, Charles said, desperation creeping into his voice for the first time. The two are inseparable. Everything you do reflects on the monarchy. Then, perhaps I should no longer be queen consort, Camilla said quietly, the words falling into the room like a death sentence. Charles felt the world shift around him as he processed what she had just suggested. The idea of Camilla stepping back from her role, or worse, leaving him entirely, was something he had never seriously considered. Throughout all their years together, through every crisis and scandal, he had taken for granted that she would stand by his side. You don't mean that, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Don't I? Camilla asked, moving toward the door. You've made it clear that the monarchy comes first, that my family relationships are expendable, that my personal loyalty means less than institutional preservation. Why would I want to remain part of an institution that values me so little? Charles watched helplessly as the woman who had been his anchor for so many years walked toward the door, her posture straight and determined despite the emotional devastation of the day. He wanted to call out to her, to find words that would bridge the chasm that had opened between them, but his voice seemed to have deserted him entirely. At the doorway, Camilla paused and turned back to look at him one final time. I have loved you for most of my adult life, Charles, she said, her voice soft but final. I supported you through your mother's death, through the transition to kingship, through every challenge and crisis. I asked for nothing except trust and partnership in return. Camilla, please. But I won't sacrifice my children for your crown, she continued, cutting off his plea. I won't abandon the people who loved me before I had any connection to royalty. And I won't remain married to a man who sees me as a potential threat to his throne. With those words, she left the room, her footsteps echoing down the hallway until they faded into silence. Charles stood alone among the scattered evidence of his wife's family's betrayal, realizing that in his determination to protect the monarchy, he may have destroyed the one relationship that had brought meaning and happiness to his personal life. The evening had descended upon London with unusual swiftness, as if the very sky sensed the gravity of the events unfolding within the walls of Clarence House. Charles stood alone in his study, the leather portfolio now closed and set aside, but its contents had fundamentally altered the course of his life and marriage. The weight of the crown had never felt more burdensome than it did in these quiet moments of reflection. Down in the main courtyard, Camilla emerged from the house with a dignity that belied the turmoil raging within her heart. She had changed into a simple dark coat and carried only a small handbag, her movements purposeful despite the devastating events of the day. The royal protection officers who had been assigned to her looked uncertain, unsure of their role now that the Queen Consort appeared to be acting independently of royal protocols. Sir Edmund Worthington had been waiting in the courtyard, having anticipated that the conversation between the royal couple would not end well. His weathered face showed the strain of managing multiple crises simultaneously, and he approached Camilla with the careful deference of someone walking through a minefield. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, "perhaps we should discuss the arrangements for your visit to see Mr. Parker Bowles. There are security considerations and media management issues that need to be addressed." Camilla looked at him with eyes that seemed to have aged years in the span of a single afternoon. "Sir Edmund, I appreciate your dedication to your duty, but I am no longer acting in my capacity as Queen Consort. I am going to see my son as his mother, nothing more." "I'm afraid it's not quite that simple, Your Majesty," Sir Edmund replied gently. "Regardless of the capacity in which you're acting, your presence at the police station will be interpreted as a royal statement. The media will draw their own conclusions. Then, let them," Camilla said with a firmness that surprised even herself. "I have spent decades worrying about how my actions would be interpreted, how they would affect the monarchy's reputation, how they would be perceived by the press and public. Today, I choose to simply be a mother." As she moved toward the waiting car, the protection officers fell into step behind her, their professional training overriding any personal doubts about the wisdom of this course of action. They had sworn to protect her regardless of the political implications of her decisions, and their duty was clear even if the consequences were not. Inside Clarence House, Charles had moved to his private quarters, where photographs from happier times seemed to mock him from every surface. Images of their wedding day, state visits where Camilla had charmed foreign dignitaries, quiet family moments captured during holidays at Balmoral, all served as painful reminders of what he stood to lose through his unwavering commitment to duty. His private secretary knocked softly on the door before entering with the latest reports from the crisis management team. The arrest of Tom Parker Bowles had indeed reached the media, and the first speculative stories about royal family connections were already appearing online. The palace's carefully crafted statements had done little to contain the speculation, and rumors about Queen Consort Camilla's response were beginning to circulate. "The Prime Minister's office has called twice requesting a briefing on the situation," Sir Edmund reported, his voice carefully neutral. "There are concerns about the constitutional implications if Queen Consort Camilla were to step back from her official duties." Charles nodded absently, his mind still reeling from the conversation with his wife. "What are the constitutional implications, Edmund, if she chooses to withdraw from royal duties while remaining married to me?" Sir Edmund consulted his notes carefully. "There is no direct precedent, Your Majesty. The closest historical comparison would be when Princess Margaret withdrew from many official duties following her personal scandals, but she was never Queen Consort. The legal scholars are divided on whether the Queen Consort role can be suspended while maintaining the marriage. And if she chooses to leave entirely?" Charles asked, though the words felt like poison in his mouth. "That would create a constitutional crisis unlike anything we've faced in modern times," Sir Edmund replied honestly. "There would be questions about the stability of the monarchy, about your ability to rule effectively, about the succession and the future of the institution itself." Charles walked to the window overlooking the courtyard where Camilla's car had departed 20 minutes earlier. The empty space where her vehicle had been parked seemed to symbolize the void that was opening up in his life. For all his preparation for kingship, he had never anticipated that his greatest crisis would be entirely personal in nature. Meanwhile, across London at the Metropolitan Police Headquarters, Camilla's arrival had indeed created the media sensation that Sir Edmund had predicted. Photographers and television crews had materialized as if from thin air, their cameras capturing every moment of her dignified walk from the car to the building's entrance. Her refusal to acknowledge their shouted questions only added to the speculation about her state of mind and the royal family's internal dynamics. Inside the police station, Tom Parker Bowles sat in an interview room that felt far removed from the comfortable world he had known as the stepson of the king. The charges against him were serious enough to warrant holding him without bail, and the reality of his situation was only beginning to sink in. When his solicitor informed him that his mother was requesting a visit, he felt a mixture of relief and shame that nearly overwhelmed him. The meeting between mother and son took place in a sterile visiting room designed to prevent any private communication that might compromise the ongoing investigation. Camilla's first sight of Tom in police custody was devastating. The confident, successful businessman she had raised had been replaced by a frightened man who seemed to have aged years in a matter of hours. "Mom, I'm so sorry," were his first words, and Camilla could see genuine remorse in his eyes despite the terrible choices that had led them to this moment. "Tell me the truth, Tom," Camilla said quietly, her voice steady despite the emotional turmoil she felt. "All of it. No matter how bad it is, I need to understand what really happened." Over the next hour, Tom revealed the full extent of his activities, and Camilla began to understand how completely her family had betrayed the trust placed in them. The story that emerged was one of gradual corruption, where small ethical compromises had grown into serious criminal activity over a period of several years. What had started as using his royal connections to secure better tables at restaurants had evolved into manipulating government contracts worth millions of pounds. "I never meant for it to go this far," Tom said, his voice breaking. "It started so innocently, just mentioning that I was connected to the royal family to get better business opportunities. But then, people started offering me money for information, for introductions, for access. The amounts got larger and larger, and I told myself I wasn't really hurting anyone." Camilla listened without judgment, though each revelation added to her understanding of how thoroughly her son had compromised both himself and the royal family. The man she had raised to value integrity and hard work had been corrupted by the very privileges that his connection to the monarchy had provided. "What about Derek? What about Sarah?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Tom looked away, unable to meet her eyes. "Derek was deeper into it than I was. The gambling debts were real, but he was also laundering money for some very dangerous people. And Sarah, she was selling information to anyone who would pay for it. Not just gossip, but serious intelligence about security arrangements, travel plans, private conversations." The scope of the betrayal was staggering, and Camilla began to understand why Charles had felt compelled to take such drastic action. Her family had not merely exploited their royal connections for personal gain. They had potentially compromised national security and put lives at risk. "Do you understand what this means for Charles and me?" Camilla asked quietly. Tom nodded miserably. "I know you'll have to distance yourself from us. I know this will probably destroy your marriage. Mom, I would do anything to undo what I've done, but it's too late now." "It's not about what I have to do," Camilla corrected him. "It's about what's right. Charles has asked me to choose between my family and my role as queen consort. But that's not really the choice, is it? The choice is between enabling your destructive behavior and holding you accountable for your actions." Tom looked up at her with surprise, perhaps expecting unconditional support despite his crimes. "What are you saying, Mom?" "I'm saying that loving you doesn't mean protecting you from the consequences of your choices," Camilla replied, her voice growing stronger. "I'm saying that being your mother means wanting you to face what you've done and learn from it, even if that's painful for both of us." The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult of Camilla's life. She had to explain to her son that while she would always love him, she could not publicly support him while he was facing criminal charges for activities that had betrayed the royal family's trust. The distinction between private love and public accountability was something Tom struggled to understand, but Camilla was determined to make it clear. As their visit concluded, Camilla realized that her perspective on the choice Charles had presented to her had fundamentally shifted. This was not simply about choosing between her family and the monarchy. It was about choosing between enabling destructive behavior and upholding the principles that both she and Charles were supposed to represent. When she emerged from the police station 90 minutes later, the waiting media could see a change in her demeanor. The woman who had entered looking devastated and conflicted now appeared resolute, as if she had reached some kind of internal decision during her time inside. The ride back to Clarence's house was conducted in silence, with Camilla staring out the window at the London streets while processing everything she had learned. By the time her car pulled into the courtyard, she had made the most difficult decision of her life, one that would surprise everyone who thought they understood her motivations and loyalties. Charles was waiting for her in the drawing room where their day had begun, though the evening light had transformed the familiar space into something that felt almost foreign. He looked up as she entered, hope and apprehension warring in his expression as he tried to read her mood and intentions. "How is Tom?" he asked quietly, though he could see from her face that the visit had been emotionally devastating. "He's admitted to everything," Camilla replied, taking a seat across from him in the same chair she had occupied during their morning confrontation. "The charges are all true, Charles. My family really did betray us in the most fundamental ways possible." Charles felt a complex mixture of vindication and sorrow as she confirmed what the investigation had revealed. "I'm sorry you had to hear that from him directly." "No, I needed to hear it," Camilla said firmly. "I needed to understand the full scope of what they did, and I needed Tom to see that his actions had consequences beyond just legal penalties." Charles studied her face, trying to determine what decision she had reached about their marriage and their future together. "What happens now, Camilla?" She looked at him directly for the first time since returning, and Charles was surprised to see determination rather than devastation in her eyes. "Now I prove that my loyalty to you and to the monarchy isn't conditional on protecting my family from the consequences of their actions."